and we now welcome the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, Rabbi Dr. Warren Goldstein, joining us from Johannesburg. Rabbi, thank you so much for being with us on I24 News. So these are serious allegations of genocide being brought to the International Court of Justice by South Africa, a claim that's being slammed here as ludicrous when Israel is defending itself from a terror group that literally has a charter in which it outlines the goal of eliminating Jews. Genocide. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, the allegations are absurd. They're beyond the pale. They're offensive. They're in fact the South African government, through making these charges, and the United Nations through its ICJ, by even accepting the case in the first place, is complicit in supporting the genocidal tactics of Hamas. But what we really have to understand here, and I think this goes to the heart of it, there was this presentation now just in the news clip just before I came on with an analysis of the judges. Let's be clear, this is not about law. This is purely politics. The ICJ, that has a very fancy name, International Court of Justice. Now, that's a very fancy name. Ultimately, it is an organ of the United Nations. It is appointed by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The General Assembly of the United Nations has 193 member countries. Of those, only 84 would actually be defined as free societies. So it is an organization that is overrun by despots, by tyrannies, and they are appointing this court. This court has no credibility. In the entire process is a purely political process with the idea of damaging Israel, destroying Israel, preventing Israel from exercising its right to self-defense. And I think it's important to understand who the South Africans are. The South African government is not doing this out of any concern for human rights. Anybody who knows them, this ANC government, they don't care about their own people. They've presided over a murder rate of 27,000 people every single year. This is a government and a ruling party that has no qualms about stealing billions and billions of rands to the detriment and suffering of its people. A government that managed to put together a legal team for the ICJ, of the top-class legal team, drawing up papers that have the facade and the veneer of being things which are legal when in fact it's pure politics, but they went to a lot of effort. This is a government that hasn't prosecuted a single senior member of its own party for the state capture years. So this has got nothing to do with human rights, and this is pure politics. South Africa is an ally of Iran. Within a very close period of time, the South African foreign minister visited Tehran shortly after October 7. This is a government and the President Ramaphosa did everything in his power to include Iran, which is widely regarded as the biggest global sponsor of terror. President Ramaphosa did everything in his power to include Iran in BRICS. So they are here at the behest of the Iranians. And in the same way that Iran deployed Hamas, this is not a war between Israel and Hamas. Let's be clear. This is a war between Israel and Iran. Iran is seeking the utter destruction of Israel. It has its proxies, Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis in Yemen, its pursuit of its nuclear weapons, and now it has deployed the South Africans, and using the history of the South African anti-apartheid movement led by the ANC to use the veneer of that acceptability and those credentials of human rights to wound Israel. But in fact, everyone needs to know this ANC government is not the government of Nelson Mandela. They do not have moral credibility to govern their own country. In the opinion polls, they are dropping well below 50%. They do not enjoy the support of their own people. And this is a government that is there at the behest of the Iranians. This needs to be seen for what it is. And the Iranians and the South Africans and the enemies of Israel are very clever. They're using the UN. The United Nations is an utterly corrupt organization that does not deserve any kind of credibility. It is an organization that has for many years and decades been dominated by autocracies, by dictatorships.
Right.
Free democracies in the world need to come together, and this is all a charade. It looks like law. It's got absolutely nothing to do with law at all.
Rabbi, you have made this argument that the South African government is acting as Iran's ally and a proxy to these Islamic State's plans to destroy the Jewish state. These are bold statements. What kind of response have you had to that assertion inside South Africa?
Well, I think there's another point here, Benita, which I think is absolutely critical in doing so, and that's why I say that they're operating as Iranian allies here, because they're betraying one of the biggest human rights crises in the African continent, which is the jihadi war against Christians in Africa. It's a story which is hardly told in the world because when people say Black Lives Matter, that means Black Lives Matter, but not in Africa, not when they're Christians and not when they are murdered by jihadis. And what is happening in this jihadist war against Christians in Africa is that thousands and thousands of Christians are murdered, beheaded, and kidnapped across the border of South Africa. In Mozambique, there is ISIS Mozambique that is waging a war against Christian communities in Mozambique. Not a word from the South African government, by supporting Hamas, who is in fact the ideological brothers in arms of ISIS, of Al-Shabaab, of Boko Haram in Africa. In fact, what is happening here, that they are siding with those forces of violence on the African continent against their own fellow Christians. And this is something that I have spoken about. It is so important to understand the war that is being waged against Israel. Israel is on the front lines of this war, but actually what is happening, this is a war against civilized values, and it is a war of jihadi armies sponsored by Iran, and the South African involvement in this is nothing short of a disgrace. But I must say and you will know this, Benita's coming from South Africa, the South African people do not support the ANC. I can tell you, so I've had so many in opinion polls, they are now falling well below 50%. But on this issue of Israel and Jews, I can tell you, I've had so many calls from overseas. Are we okay? Is the community okay? And I can tell you that we have some of the lowest rates of anti-Semitism in the world. Jews feel very comfortable in the streets in South Africa. And that is not because of the South African government. That is in spite of the South African government. This president, by falsely accusing Israel of genocide, has done everything in his power to promote anti-Semitism, because if you accuse the Jewish state and you accuse those who support Israel of being guilty of genocide, that is a way of making it acceptable to persecute Jews. But on the ground in South Africa, the vast majority of South Africans support Israel, support the Jewish people, understand what is going on here. There are huge churches in South Africa, large groups of Christians, and across the board in South Africa, so much support. And this government is completely out of step with its own people.
Rabbi, from the perspective here inside this country, since the 7th of October, we know that Hamas terrorists filmed the atrocities. There is footage of the abductions of children, mothers holding their babies, elderly peace activists. On our screen right now, we're looking at Kfir Bibas, 9 months old at the time of the abduction, with Ariel, his 4-year-old brother, and their mom, Shiri. Kfir Bibas turned 1 in captivity. Does the world know this? From the perspective abroad, is this being shown in the media? You're talking about support, you're getting calls from different communities around the globe. Are people aware that there is a 1-year-old baby in captivity for more than 3 months?
Yeah, and I think what's really at stake here. People are aware of these facts, but they do not understand the concept of a just war of self-defense, and it is the equation of Israel waging this war and equating it to terrorism. And you have here institutions that have the veneer of this moral superiority. The United Nations, which is an utterly corrupt institution, governed and controlled by dictatorships. But it even goes to the Pope. Pope Francis, in his call with President Herzog, told him that Israel is responding to terror with terrorism. There is a complete equation, and in essence, that kind of approach is an approach which is disastrous for the protection of human civilization. If people had taken that approach, they would have said that the Allied forces waging war against Nazi Germany were on the same level of immorality and depravity as the Germans. That itself would have made it impossible to win the Second World War. All of these voices calling for a ceasefire, whether it's the Pope, the United Nations, members of the EU and other places in the world, the call for ceasefire would mean that Iran, which is the Nazi Germany of our day, using its proxy armies, will not be defeated. And ultimately, had those voices of ceasefire been heeded in World War II, Nazi Germany would have won the war. And they were there, those voices. There was a lot of pressure on Winston Churchill. Even after Hitler had conquered all of Europe, there was a lot of pressure on Winston Churchill to cut a deal with the Germans and to make peace. And ultimately, when you're calling on Israel for a ceasefire, you are really saying, let's hand the victory to Hamas.
Also, many people around the globe asking, when ISIS was eliminated, talk to us about the calls there around the civilian casualties, something that is being debated around the globe right now. Rabbi, Israel repeatedly outlines the steps it takes to prevent civilian harm. Obviously, this will be something discussed at The Hague. But if the judges were to order, in effect, Israel to stop its war against Hamas, how do you think this could tarnish Israel's image internationally, in South Africa as well? Briefly, please.
Well, to my mind, it doesn't tarnish Israel's reputation. And it's important to explain this. ICJ, so-called International Court of Justice, is not a court. This is a body of the United Nations.
Right.
These are not independent judges. These are judges appointed by the dictatorships and the autocracies of the world. There are a few that come from free societies, but ultimately this is not an objective court. I don't even think that Israel should go there in the first place. Why should Israel accept a summons to appear before such a court on charges of genocide? You know that when Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, when he signed the Geneva Accords on behalf of the State of Israel, and he accepted the idea that genocide would be a crime and a crime against humanity, did he think in his wildest dreams that the United Nations would become the cesspit of anti-Semitism that it has become? He would never have signed it. I think that people say that Israel has a legal duty to appear before the International Court of Justice. I think you could make a strong argument that says ultimately it is based on the agreements signed, the Geneva Accords signed. They were signed with the understanding that the term of genocide and the United Nations would not be weaponized against the Jewish state to prevent it from defending itself. Because if all of these people had their way, Israel would have no right of self-defense and it would be wiped out.
Right.
The International Court of Justice, and I would like to say the so-called International Court of Justice, does not have a shred of credibility. It is a body of the United Nations. And I tell you what this case brings to the fore, and it's a very important lesson for the free world.
Right.
You cannot have free democracies like Israel, the United States, the EU, India, Japan, wherever they may be. You cannot have free societies ceding their sovereign right to defend themselves and to manage their own affairs to bodies of the United Nations, which is a body which is dominated by autocracies and tyrannies. You cannot do that. There needs to be a new world order. Countries and societies that are democratic and free need to form a new global alliance. They cannot give the power to the United Nations. The United Nations has this veneer of credibility.
Right.
There is nothing there. It is politics. It is dominated by dictatorships and autocracies, and its history shows an obsessive anti-Israel streak, which is in accordance with the fact that it is dominated by all of these autocracies.
Right. We're going to have to leave it there. You know, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did say the genocide claim by South Africa is meritless. We wait to see what happens at The Hague on Thursday and on Friday. Thank you so much for your insight, Rabbi Dr. Warren Goldstein, the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, live from Johannesburg. Thank you for your time on I-24 News.
Thank you so much.